Good morning, brothers. Today we're going to try to get to the Spanish Golden Century, but I foresee we're not going to have enough time to speak about the Spanish Golden Century. Nonetheless, I think I can lay the foundations so in our next period we can delve into the Spanish Golden Century. Definitely you studied those medieval epics on your own, and that corresponds to the Middle Ages. Now, when we try to see what was behind the Spanish Golden Century, we have definitely to resort to Italian Renaissance. But the question is, what happens in between? Well, as you can see in the medieval epics, we have little or no influence of the classical works and the classical canons, right? And the Renaissance is a period of rediscovery of those canons and those ideals. So it pertains not only to the structure or the form in architecture or in art, but it also pertains to the themes. That is what is particular about the Renaissance. In some instances, it might be kind of schematic to say that the Renaissance was anthropocentric, meaning centered in man, whereas the Middle Ages were theocentric, meaning centered in God. Of course, that's a caricature. And that is very schematic, because it is not like the Renaissance disregards God, and it is not like the Middle Ages disregard man, but at least it shows some particular shift or some particular tilt. But be aware of the fact that this, if you emphasize it too much, you are going to end up with a caricature, and you have to read the authors and pay attention to what they are actually saying. Don't say that Middle Ages forgot man, and don't say that the Renaissance forgot God. There's also a lot of... It's a popular conception to think that the Middle Ages were the Dark Ages. Like there was nothing insightful or nothing profound or no reflection, and they were all victims of superstition. That's a common narrative, but it's very, very false. Because you can read the medieval epics, and you can, not only literature, but you can also read the medieval scholars and see how enlightened they were. That is why Chesterton, with his irony and his being the prince of the paradox, calls the Renaissance rather a relapse. Like they fell back into antiquity. And that is, of course, he wants to be provocative. If I have to make a general assessment, and of course it's general, and I'm not delving into the punctual aspects, as far as it has to do with arts, definitely Renaissance goes beyond the Middle Ages. And I think that the aesthetic canons of the Renaissance definitely bring in something new and something beautiful that the Middle Ages didn't have. On the other hand, we have to recognize that as far as it has to do with philosophy, the summits that were attained during the Middle Ages were hardly ever attained during the Renaissance or the Baroque. Speaking now about Italian Renaissance, and I'm speaking about Italian Renaissance because it was very influential for the Spanish Golden Century. We have great authors like Petrarch that you are going to study on your own, Picus Mirandolensis, Pico della Mirandola in his Italian language, Angelus Politianus, Johannes Veronensis, Erasmus of Rotterdam, and many other writers that are called the Renaissance authors. And they revived Latin elegance. Just two quick remarks before I move on. The first is Petrarch. You are going to study him on your own, but I just want to emphasize that although he was the first of the great Renaissance writers, he's also allegedly the best. Maybe the only one who could contend with him would be Erasmus of Rotterdam, who is practically the latest of all of them. And that is remarkable because usually those who begin have some flaws, precisely because they are beginning, but Petrarch would be the exception that confirms the rule. The other remark I wanted to make pertains Johannes Veronensis, John of Verona. He wrote a letter, well, actually he wrote a lot of things, but he wrote, in this particular letter, he wrote to his son. His son responded that you've made some mistakes in your Latin. Your Latin is not as elegant. Maybe your Latin is still too medieval. So he was reproving some of the mistakes of Johannes Veronensis, and don't think that he was making mistakes in the declensions. It has to do with mistakes in style, being more or less close to Cicero and Virgil and Sallust and the great models of the golden age of of Latin literature. Okay, so your Latin was not as elegant. Maybe that's not the word that Cicero would have used, or that's not the way this would have been phrased. And the answer that Johannes Veronensis writes to this rebuke that he's receiving from his son is, "I am very happy that you, my son, can realize these things. And I just want you to know that when I started studying Latin, there was no one who could understand Cicero. Much less was there someone who could write like him. So we started, and of course there are still some flaws in our penning, but I'm happy that you are seeing those flaws, and I hope that you can continue improving." And eventually, yes, Renaissance authors continued improving until we attain that other peak, who is Erasmus of Rotterdam. So those are the two greatest proponents of the Renaissance literature, at least in Latin. Although Petrarch also wrote a good deal in Italian, and he contributed a lot to the formation of Italian as a new language. But in Latin, we have a wide variety of authors, but Erasmus of Rotterdam and Petrarch are the greatest by far. Of course, I am not mentioning someone, Dante. He wrote a good deal in Latin as well. Maybe its particular a work that deserves particular mention is De Vulgari Eloquentia, a work that he wrote in Latin about the importance of writing in other languages, especially Tuscan dialect. So he receives the heritage of some other authors that had already initiated what was known in that time dolce stil nuovo, the sweet new style, and Dante takes it to its highest peak. And we don't have Dante in this literature course, not because he's not important, on the contrary, because he's too important, and that's why we dedicate him an entire seminar the coming semester. But just to make a few points about Dante, his Divine Comedy has no parallel. Nothing or no work can rival with the structure of the Divine Comedy. You can say that Shakespeare is more reflective, that Victor Hugo has a better narrative, or that Virgil has more lyricism. Go ahead, say that. But don't say that any work can contend, much less equal, the Divine Comedy as far as it has to do with its structure. And reading the Divine Comedy is thrilling. It's something that takes your breath, because you see how Dante was like a King Midas. You know the myth of King Midas, right? Whatever he touched, he turned into gold. Whatever Dante touches, he turns into poetry. And it's impressive how he could speak about everyday things and very commonplace affairs. I'm not making an exaggeration. He mentions ants. And from ants, he transforms them into poetry. And he has that great merit that I hope we will have the occasion to delve into when we come to the next semester. Spanish Golden Century. The Spanish Golden Century receives a lot of influence of this. I don't think the Spanish Golden Century would have happened, and certainly it wouldn't have happened the way it happened if it had not been thanks to the Italian influence. A major remarkable thing is the use of endecasyllables, meaning verses of 11 syllables or 11 lines. That is something that had started in Italy and that then Spanish writers borrow from Italian writers. There are at least two very, very well-known instances where endecasyllables are used. One of the most important ones is the sonnet. The sonnet. A poem composed of 14 lines, each one of them with 11 syllables. There are different structures, because there's the Petrarchan sonnet that brings in a rhyming pattern of A, B, B, A, B, B, A, C, D, C, D, C, D. Instead, the Shakespearean sonnet has a different rhyming pattern, but nonetheless, they are sonnets, and that is something that they owe to the Italian influence. Then we have a properly Spanish metrical pattern, which is called lira in Spanish, lyre. Okay, and it corresponds to a pattern of 7-11, 7-7-11. The rhyming pattern is A, B, A, B, B. Why is lira called lira? Because of a poem that Garcilaso de la Vega created. Garcilaso de la Vega is the first one who writes with this metrical pattern, although eventually he would be excelled and surpassed by far, first by Fray Luis de León, by brother Luis de León, and second by the greatest poet who ever lived, St. John of the Cross. Si de mi baja lira tanto pudiese el son que en un momento aplacase la ira del animoso viento, de la furia del mar y el movimiento. That is the first verse of this poem written by Garcilaso de la Vega. Garcilaso de la Vega is the creator of this metrical pattern, and we owe to him that that properly Spanish metrical pattern was created, and eventually it was developed during the Spanish Renaissance. We haven't arrived to the Spanish Golden Century yet. We are still framed within the Spanish Renaissance, but now we are in Spain, and now we are seeing what's happening there and how that would influence the Spanish Golden Century. Besides, yes?
What is the time frame that you're talking about now?
Yes, good question. The Spanish Golden Century would go somewhere from the mid-1500s to the mid-1600s.
So the Catholic kings around there.
So
around the time of the Catholic kings.
I'm going to mention them in a while, and I think everything is going to be clear. So the Spanish Golden Century, if you need a time frame, you would put it from the mid-1500s to the mid-1600s, although some stretch it as far as 1680, the date of the death of Pedro Calderón de la Barca. Now, when did it start? We could say that it was around the the mid 1500s. So it was with the beginning of the reign of Philip II of Spain. Before him, we have Charles V of Spain, the first of the empire. No, it was the other way around. Charles I of Spain, the fifth of the empire, because he was the emperor and the king of Spain at the same time. And he began his rule in 1517 until his death in 1555. So it's easy to remember it because it's 555. It's 1555 when he died, and when the rule passes to his son, Philip II. And before him, yes, we have the Catholic kings. The Catholic kings who had united Spain in 1492. Then they had expelled the last Muslim kingdom from Granada, and then after that they had also sponsored, although that happened in 1492, the journey of Christopher Columbus. But I'm glad we have a time frame now, and we're running out of time. Next class, I'm going to continue speaking about the actual Spanish Golden Century. Okay? Thank you, brothers.